So, like Professor Dew and Associate Provost Winters, it's my opinion that the metric that we need to use to understand who we will be is necessarily going to have to be an aspect of how the Williams community has built up an image of what it thinks it is now. So to me, that most apparent criterion is diversity. I'm a freshman here, so my earliest experience at getting an inside look on how the Williams community views itself was during First Days. And mine was a First Days that was as much about celebrating the Williams community as nurturing one of the broadest spectrums of identities in this country, as it was about how exactly do I find the basement to Hopkins Hall. For the record, I still don't know. Diversity, having many people who subscribe to different descriptive identities, is overwhelmingly the lens through which the Williams community judges who it is. It's part of why we're here today. We're celebrating the legacy of Jack Sawyer. So if we want to, we can judge how we are by how we look different now than we did back then. And if we do that, it's clear that we've changed a whole lot. And if that's as far as we decide to go with this question of who we will be, then I think that we can easily predict the answer that we're going to get to that question. It's not particularly interesting, it's fairly bland and boring. But it's a version of this question that I'm going to contend with now so that we can move on and start talking about more interesting things, or at least I think they're more interesting. So if Williams continued to evaluate who it is through diversity in 10 years or however far down the line, who we will be will simply be a community that's housed in sort of a bigger tent than the one Jack Sawyer had put up for us, or the one that we're putting up now as present members of this community. But like I say, that's an incredibly uninspired version of this question that Professor Dew and Associate Provost Winters have already proven can be dealt with in fairly interesting ways. So let's just take all of that as a point of departure. And going forward, let's be a little more radical, a little more academic, and deconstruct that more basic rendition of the question, who we will be, and its very basic answer. And I think from that we can pull out a little more salient insight into this question. So that first look at attacking who we will be as a matter of diversity ignore the importance of what makes up the parts of people that enable us to be in any way different from the people around us. And that's identity. We're born with countless identities that we take on. They can be our race and ethnicity, they can be our sex, our sexual orientation. And then as we go about this business of living, there are other identities that we take on. Our gender identity and presentation, our religious affiliations, our political affiliations, our collegiate affiliations, to name a few. So there are several, if not countless, categories of identity that every single person has to contend with. And within those categories, there are countless different ways in which we might identify. So if we know that, then what are we meant to expect of identity? Are we just a million different identifications in silos? Are we meant to expect that, for example, Professor Dew walks into his class and every other aspect of his personality as he's about to teach drops away, and he's just this repository of more facts than any of us ever needed to know about Reconstruction? Well, no. We know that's not how we work. So we need to look at people as repositories of many different, sometimes disparate identities differently. And I think in doing that, we can borrow a little bit from the mathematical statistical bent that Associate Provost Winters brought us. Although I'm not Division III, so if I'm misrepresenting any of these concepts, just don't correct me. I feel like I might be rolling. But I think if we were to take that sort of a bent and take several combinations of identities, one on the x-axis, one on the y-axis, as they relate to one another. And then stick a z-axis up there, going directly up to account for time. And see how we claim those identities in relation to one another over time. We'd end up with sort of a fitness landscape with many peaks and valleys of the degrees to which we claim those identities in different times, depending upon our situations. And I think in looking at that identity fitness landscape, what we find is that the ways in which we claim our various identities are different, they're fluid over time. We claim some of our identities and we subvert others of them as our situations require us to. And so, in spite of my slight lack of prowess in Division 3, what I think we can grab from that analysis of identity is the idea that our identities come in not always predictable and harmonious combinations, and that because of that, we claim our identities differently as we feel like we have to in order to be comfortable in certain of our environments. And I think it's fair to say, looking at that students have been integral actors in changing the ways that Williams looks. And I think they are and will continue to shape who we will be. And furthermore, the reason I believe that students want to change the way in which Williams looks as a campus and the very ways in which we are as a community has to do with how they claim their identities here. Which ones they feel empowered to claim, and which ones, as they arrive on this campus, they feel as if they have to subvert. And what we can see is that as students at Williams have begun to claim certain of their identities, they've in turn engaged in activism that has made Williams a wider tent that looks more and more diverse. So in glancing at the history of Williams' activism and inclusion of more descriptively diverse peoples in our community, we see that we began as a fairly homogeneous community, which was made up of individuals who perhaps primarily valued their identities as Williams students on this campus, because frankly, that was what was closest of their identities among people who already had a whole lot of their identities in common. Now, that was where we started, and we had a very distinct moment of change. The inclusion of people of color on this campus in the late 1800s was a radical action that took place on the part of the institution, but it set the stage for several more radical student actions that allowed students to claim their racial, gender, and sexual identities more freely on this campus, and in turn allowed altogether new groups of people to enter the Williams tent that houses our community. So have in mind the radical actions of Black students in the Hopkins takeover, the inclusion of women onto the campus in 1969, and protests to assert the visibility of LGBT students on this campus. We know so intimately the ways in which students have served as activists in claiming their racial, sexual, and gender identities. But I put it to you that we are now so diverse as a campus that our tent need not be widened in terms of inherent identities like color and orientation. I think a history of student activism has made this campus inclusive of descriptive identities that it was once so imperative for us to claim. So in thinking about that, perhaps the Williams community is not a tent that is wider and taller, or generally larger than it used to be. I think perhaps instead, the tent that describes this Williams community is made of patches or swaths of cloth, all representing the different colors of the identities we now feel empowered to claim. We look the same size and the same shape as we always have. We look more diverse, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're thinking more diversely or that we're really analyzing and claiming the fact that we claim these different identities. I think our old forms of activism that we can look to in the history of Williams College have left us nothing more than 50 shades of beige, with maybe a little bit of rainbow thrown in for good measure. We've claimed the identities of how we look already, the basic descriptors of who we are. So then, who will we be? That is to say, what are the next set of identities that students will feel that they need to claim on this campus through activism that will change the shape of our tent, and not just its color? So I was thinking about this, because I do inevitably have to answer the question. And in thinking about who will we be under this specific framework, perhaps narcissistically, I turned to myself. And this is actually the point in the presentation where I reveal that all of this has been innate to show you a cute picture of me. You all go, oh, she's so cute, and I am. But, so I thought about me. So why have me speak here today? And what do I, with my various disparate identities and the fact that I'm here, say about who we believe we will be going forward? So in coming to Williams, I never really felt the need to claim my inherent descriptors, those given identities. I'm mixed race. I'm read as black, socialized white. I'm a political socialist, but I come from a place of economic privilege. I'm queer, identified, pansexual, but I was educated in a very strong Catholic tradition. My identities are as disparate and incongruous as they come. But I think that maybe that's the point. That my identities are disparate, incongruous, and I'm aware of it. I'm not just claiming my identities, because I tend to be of the opinion we're all sort of making ourselves 50 shades of beige anyway, so what does it matter? But I'm thinking critically about my identities and the fact that they're disparate. I think that because we are now so physically diverse and open to claiming those identities, our activism has moved on from its old forms and content. As students, we're now more interested in making who we will be, most conscious of deconstructing and understanding the implications of what it means to look more diverse as a campus community. We want to lend meaning to the activism of the past with our present activism. And I think we see that as students on this campus, we're beginning to make that transition to a deeper awareness of the fluidity of our identities. The Campaign for Asian American Studies is doing its work to this end. Anonymous activism like the Columbus Day anti-imperialist protests, I think, speaks to this as well as countless other forms of present student activism that we just simply wouldn't have time to talk about today. So, given all that, I'll ask again, who will we be? And the answer, and you'll have to forgive me for this sort of qualitative, equivocal answer to this question, is that we're going to continue to be more of who we are. Who we will be is a campus that will move on to claim the next set of identities that are contradictory to the congruous ones that we're claiming now. We already are who we are, but we're going to understand who we are much better in the future.